Welcome to the Scholar's Chair. In remembrance of Dr. Martin Luther King, our focus tonight is on the theological support of nonviolence. Our program is organized by the Interfaith Coalition of Bowie, Maryland, and the Interfaith Council of Martinsville and Henry County. We're interested in discovering common ground. We're interested in eradicating misconceptions in matters of faith. And then we're just trying to get better understanding of each other's tradition and understand that our community is a very diverse faith community. Dr. King said something very interesting concerning nonviolence, and I thought I was really taken by the fact that he was really fighting the other side of this, and that was his notion of being a pacifist. And he was constantly warring with that idea. But he said here, if we assume that mankind has the right to survive, then we must find an alternative to war and destruction. In our day of space vehicles and guided ballistic missiles, the choice is either nonviolence or non-existence.
Tameeka, Washington. I'm the founder and president of the Interfaith Coalition of Bowie, and we have a great lineup of speakers today. So our first speaker will be Reverend Ryan Ware of Smith Memorial at the United Methodist Church in Martinsville, Virginia.
I'm so excited to be here today and to be discussing this. I think, as Khalil said, in such an important moment in our history as a people on this planet. Really, my mind, when I first start thinking about theological justifications, begins in the prophets. As we've just come out of Advent, and we're in the season after Epiphany in the Christian church, and so we've just heard these prophecies foretelling the Messiah told anew. And in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, it says, God will judge between the nations and settle disputes of mighty nations. They will beat their swords into iron plows and their spears into pruning tools. Nation will not take up sword against nation. They will no longer learn how to make war. And I think as we, look for the Prince of Peace in our tradition in the season of Advent, and as we're hearing of Jesus starting his ministry, we are reminded of Jesus as the embodiment of our theology, that God became flesh and dwelt among us and lived among us, that God might show us the way. And I'm particularly drawn to the Sermon on the Mount. And I know Dr. King talked about this a lot, but in Matthew's version of this, Jesus is talking about, you've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, you must not oppose those who want to hurt you. If people slap you on your right cheek, you must turn the left cheek to them as well. Jesus not only teaches and preaches and talks about this, but Jesus lives out this in his ministry as well. He engages with the legal experts when they're trying to entrap him on the law, reminding them of the great commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart, but then also reminds them of the call to love your neighbor as himself. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, particularly, Jesus talks about, how to live that out of the man who cares for this man on the side of the road and goes to care him and puts him up and pays for his lodging. And I'm also reminded of the scripture as we're coming up toward Easter of Jesus's betrayal in the garden, when one of the disciples cuts off the ear of one of the slaves of the soldiers, and Jesus says, no, stop, put your swords away, and he heals the slave. In my own tradition in United Methodism, John Wesley believes that the fruit of all of this, right? We learn all of this theology, we study it, we're taught it, but the fruit of this, John Wesley would say, comes in a life that is well lived. And that really is where we take this idea of all that we've been taught in the scriptures and begin to put it into practice, and that we are called to this way of nonviolence and called to this way of peacemaking. Um, in all that we say and do, we're talking about in church today about, that if we're living in this way, then that means we have to work until our governments are caring for people, right? Until there's no more people who are suffering from violence. And that means then we also are called to take an active stance toward this. And I think Dr. King so beautifully embodies this for us, of this way of showing up, of embodying what it means to practice this nonviolence as a way of responding to the powers and principalities of the day. And I think that just comes right from our foundational understanding of who Jesus was and the ways in which he opens the scriptures and interprets that for us, so that we then can live our lives where we are embodying these scriptures. And, until such time as the world can be at peace, we have a lot of work to do. We are called to continue to advocate for justice, to continue to advocate for peace. And I think that until such time as the world is nonviolent and war has gone away, the biggest stand against the war machine, the biggest stand against violence, is the way of nonviolence, is the way of peace, and of reaching out to one another and sharing the love of God with our neighbors.
Well said. And I love that quote, the beating the swords into plowshares, where we're working together for a better world. Thank you. So our next speaker will be Rabbi Steve Weisman from Temple Shalel here in Bowie, Maryland. Over to you, Rabbi Steve.
Thank you, Tameeka. Thank you, Reverend Ware. Thank you, Khalil. Always good to be with you, my friend Dawud, as well. And I thank Reverend Ware for starting us off with good scripture from the Hebrew prophets. That piece that he shared from Isaiah also appears in the words spoken by God through the prophet Micah, almost word for word. And I start from a place of middle ground, because if we're acknowledging that, we also need to acknowledge that one of God's other prophets in those same biblical prophets, Joel, preached exactly the opposite. That there are times that we actually need to turn our pruning hooks into spears and our farming implements into weapons of war, because sometimes we have to show our strength. And I start there because I make a distinction between seeking peace and Dr. King's use of nonviolence to achieve change and ends. And one of the things that I've learned from my own tradition, I think, and certainly from studying the work of Dr. King, is that in order for nonviolence to work, the strength and the resolve and the faith of the one who is practicing the nonviolence has to be beyond question. Because anytime we go out into the world strong in ourselves in life, it's like the old Wild West. We bring upon ourselves the daring of those who would make a name at our expense. And therefore, the gunslinger, and I can't help but think of Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles here, and I don't mean to make it into a punchline, but the fact that the Waco Kid wasn't defeated in gunfights, but he was beaten down by the constant challenges to his superiority, by everybody who wished to make a name at his expense. And that's what took him out of being an active participant in the life of his community in whatever form it was. And I start there because I marvel at that distinction. The kid on the playground who is perceived to be the bully is rarely, if ever, picked on. The one who starts out by saying, why can't we all just get along, and has no backing to his stance and those words, risks being picked on. It takes strength to be nonviolent. And I think the beauty of the prophetic words is to acknowledge that there's an ideal and there's also a reality that enters every now and then. And all of us in the religion business are in the game of working towards the ideal. That's what the Messianic age is. It's the idea of whether it's a person or an age that we bring about by our own actions, depending on our different beliefs, creating a utopian society in which what we've grown accustomed to as the normal working of things is suspended for the sake of a peaceful all glorious ending and a harmony in living together. There are those I've certainly heard from among my Christian friends and colleagues who seek to make a distinction between the God of the Old Testament being a God of war and the God of the New Testament being a God of peace. And I think there's some truth in that, if I'm being honest.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of that is not because God evolves and changes from one testament to the other, but rather we as human beings and as society evolve in our understanding of God. The biblical worldview is predicated in the idea that bad things happen because God's upset with our behavior and wants to correct it, frequently through punishment in the form of sending enemy armies to teach us a hard lesson. That's the way the Hebrew Bible plays out. And so this idea that Joel can say that sometimes you have to take up arms in defense of yourself is very much a part of bringing peace. If that peace is not just going to be the absence of warfare with enemies, but also the maximalization of our potential as individuals and as our own internal community. But then the biblical world ends. And there's 2,000 years of Judaism that evolves from it. And at every step after that, we build upon Isaiah and Micah far more than we build upon Joel. In Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the rabbinic fathers from 2,000 years ago, there are two great statements about the foundations of society and the universe. The first is a very particularistic Jewish statement that says the world is sustained by three things: Torah, Jewish text; avodah, worship and service to God; and gimilut chasadim, loving kindness in our acts towards each other. At the end of that same first chapter, where that's the first teaching, the last teaching is the world is established on three things, and it's a much more universal three. It's on truth, it's on justice, and it's on peace. And those are not contradictory statements. Those are statements that flesh each other out, one from a particularistic point of view, and the other how we project that out into the world. And so they complement each other very clearly. The rabbis of the Midrash look at incidents like the death of the Egyptians in the sea in the Exodus from Egypt. And they forgive the singing of a victory song of joy by Miriam and Moses and the people when they escape and get safely across the sea. But they tell this story that at the same time that on earth, the Israelites were thanking God for their salvation, the angels above joined in the song. And at that moment, God rebuked the angels, reminding them that they themselves had not been redeemed from the servitude in Egypt. So they did not have a need to be rejoicing in that moment, especially because as ministering angels, they had to be aware that the Egyptians, who are also God's children and God's creation, had to die to bring that salvation, that redemption about. And therefore, God chose to chastise the angels in that moment. And the rabbis taught that lesson to teach us the power and the importance of nonviolence, of peace. The liturgy that we use still to this day speaks constantly of God as being Oseh Shalom, the maker of peace. Mm-hmm. It implores us to follow and to aspire to be God-like in our actions and our approach. Mm-hmm. If God is the maker of peace, how can we be anything but seekers after peace? How can we do anything but, given a choice between having to take up arms or seeking to make peace, not do all that we can first to seek the peace and to work for peace? And I leave this with the ending with which I started. Even in modern times, two great leaders of the modern state of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, before they became politicians and national leaders, were both generals. They both referred to the work that they did in the 90s and the early 2000s to try and achieve peace with their Arab and particularly their Muslim Arab neighbors as waging peace. And I can't think of a more conflicted but more honest assessment of the power of nonviolence, both as a tool and as a desired outcome, than that.
That sometimes it takes strength to be nonviolent, and that sometimes there is a need for strength. is a very important message that we need to remember as well. All right, our final speaker will be Dawud Abdur-Rahman, a Muslim author and educator from Maryland. Dawud, over to you.
Same thing. When I saw the topic, is there theological support for nonviolence? I thought about it within the context of resistance and oppression, because the reality is it's easy to be nonviolent when you're not being tested, but the real issue is, do you have, piggyback on Rabbi Weisman, do you have the strength to be nonviolent when you are being tested, when your impulse might be to respond in kind? So I want to start out just by saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. I just want to start out by saying Al-Islam is not a pacifist nor warmongering belief system. It seeks to strike something in between and give choices to those who follow the guidance of the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. I also realized, stepping back for just a second, that there are some listeners and viewers who might think that having a Muslim talk about nonviolence is almost antithetical to what Al-Islam is, because in the media, it's rare that you're actually seeing a Muslim protesting nonviolently. There's a regular incorrect conflation of the term jihad, which means struggle, with holy war. Jihad means struggle; it doesn't mean holy war. In reality and in history, Muslims have played a preponderant role in slave revolts in the Americas, physical slave revolts in the Americas. They were at the forefront of anti-colonial struggles in Africa, and if nothing else, the infamous quote from El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, that Black Americans assert the right for independence by any means necessary, I think is almost now seen as an Islamic saying. And to the point, I just happened to see this week either a TikTok or YouTube short, and if it's on TikTok or YouTube short, it must be real, where there was someone who was saying that they think that Black Americans will be better served to be Muslims versus Christians, because Christianity teaches turn the other cheek, whereas Muslims believe an eye for an eye, which is incorrect, actually. So I just want to start out by saying that a reading of the Quran and a review of the example of the Prophet Muhammad actually reveals that there's a balance that's being struck in what's been revealed and what's been demonstrated by the Prophet Muhammad. For the sake of brevity, I'll just say there's a series of ayats in the Quran that give Muslims the right to defend themselves. Muslims have the right to fight in self-defense, but not to exceed the bounds. And after a series of ayats dealing with this issue, it ends by saying, but indeed, if any show patience and forgive, that would truly be an exercise of courageous will and resolution in the conduct of affairs. So in one of these series of ayats in the Quran, at the same time, Muslims are given the right to defend themselves. It's also saying at the end of all those ayats, if you can be patient and forgive, it actually shows great will and determination. Then there's an ayat that I like to quote that I think is even more directly, it's also directly applicable, where it says, where Allah revealed, because of that, we decreed upon the children of Israel that whoever kills a soul, unless for a soul or for corruption done in the land, it is as if he had slain mankind entirely. And whoever saves one, it is as if he has saved mankind entirely. And our messengers had certainly come to them with clear proofs. Then among many of them after that throughout the land were transgressors. So this idea of killing any innocent person unjustly, as if you've slayed all of mankind, is a strong idea in the Quran. And saving one person, it's like you saved all mankind. When you look at this, the biography and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, I was reminded and wanted to share that for the first 13 years of the revelation of the Quran and the proselytizing by the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, it was a peaceful proselytizing in 13 years in Mecca. The Quran actually urges proselytizing through wisdom and beautiful preaching, and urges Muslims to strive with the Quran, which is considered a mighty striving. Also in the history of the Prophet Muhammad, there was a treaty of Hudaybiyah, which was effectively a ceasefire between the Muslims and the leaders of the Quraysh, that allowed the Muslims a period of time for peaceful proselytizing, and also ultimately led to the nonviolent conquest of Mecca. I want to turn just for a second that one of the things that I think we are often fixated on what's now called the Middle East, and go to West Africa for a second and say that one of the other misconceptions is that Islam was spread by the sword. Most of the, if not all the commentaries about West Africa, where most of the descendants of Africans enslaved in America, who were made Negro and enslaved in the United States, come from West Africa. Islam was spread by traders, scholars, and by peaceful means. That's kind of the consensus. And in West Africa, and what is now Senegal, there's an exemplar, a relatively modern exemplar of non-violent resistance, Sheikh Amadou Bamba, who was born in Senegal in 1853, died in 1927. He waged what is considered the jihad, the struggle of the pen against French colonialism. He focused on religious worship, purification, and work, and he shunned politics. He and his followers founded the city of Touba, and he was considered by his followers a renewer of the faith. I think it's important. I just want to read an excerpt from a fatwa, a religious ruling that he provided back in 1910 to advise his followers how to deal with French colonialism. He said that Amadou Bamba reminded his audience of the historical context and conditions of struggles waged by the Prophet Muhammad. And he noted that at the present time, he did not see any valid reasons to wage a physical jihad of the sword against the French. He justified his position by underlying the absence of a caliph for the global Muslim community, the weaknesses of the Ummah, the community of believers at the time, and the fact that the French did not prevent Muslims from practicing their faith. Referring to the proper attitude of Muslims under French authority, he urged them to behave toward the French the same way the Prophet treated the Christians and unbelievers in Mecca, where he was also in a position of inferiority. He supported his recommendations by quoting from the Quran, citing passages in which Allah addressed the Prophet saying, "Be nobly armed with patience. It is not for you to guide them, the unbelievers, to the right path, and guide those whom he wishes, and do not criticize those who invoke other than Allah. And to you, your way, me be to mine." So he regarded, he took a position of non-politics and co-accommodation that allowed actually the flourishing of the growth of his Sufi order in West Africa. So in conclusion, the Muslims are called to be the justly balanced community. The Quran nor the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad are on either side of an eye for an eye of the Old Testament, or a forgiveness exclusively from the New Testament. The Al-Islam and the Quran is not a pacifist faith, nor is it a warmongering faith. Allah has urged the Muslims to be the justly balanced community. The Muslims are told not to fight people who don't fight against you, and that finally the Quran is revealed per the Quran by Allah to all mankind to be a guide for people who pursue the ways of peace. So those are my opening statements and comments on this, and I look forward to the follow-on discussion.
I love how you started your talk with, it's easy to be nonviolent when you're not being tested, right?
Right.
But just bringing it to the point that there is a balance in Islam between the need to defend yourselves and the need for peace. So great message. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to Khalil for questions and answers.
Well, I am very challenged by the flip side of the argument is, and I will phrase it this way: nonviolence is definitely the principle. Well, where does it cross over into being a power?
I had the privilege this summer of walking across the Pettus Bridge in Selma, and I could not help but think that I was not alone on that bridge, just from the images that we saw of Bloody Sunday. To know that just because you take a nonviolent approach doesn't mean you're going to avoid violence, because we're dealing in a world in which we are not the only actor. And I think Dr. King saw that, and I think certainly from the sharing we've heard from all three of us so far, I think each of the faith traditions in its own way acknowledges that Dr. King was speaking with our voices. This is an idealized technique. It is an attempt to break a cycle of violence. Certainly we've seen in our own day over the last several months, to the great pain of everybody involved except the leaders on both sides, the impact of a cycle of violence that gets out of control can become. I think share a humanity that sees too many dead and wishes we could do more to make it go away and stop. And if there were those in positions of authority with the moral courage and the soul strength to say, fighting back hasn't worked, maybe we need to try something else.
And leaving the battleground would mean that that's what some of the children of Israel did when they left Egypt. It was to leave the oppressive environment, which was a step forward. Curious though, is there a time, Dawud, where the nonviolent stance or becomes a pacifist, and you become a pacifist, and you become a person who just simply do not want to be killed in war? You know, you're scared to go out there and fight for a just cause, for example.
Well, I would say, so I'll try to piggyback on Rabbi Weisman and try to loop in your first answer. Like, I don't think there's anything cowardly about resisting nonviolently, especially when you're dealing with an overwhelming, powerful opponent that has no problem killing you. You know what I mean? So to, whether it's Dr. King and the civil rights movement marchers walking across the bridge, whether it's the Black and Jewish freedom riders that rode down south and were facing against the Ku Klux Klan, whether it's any group of people, whether it's Mahatma Gandhi in India, whether it's the Palestinians, who tried peaceful protests at different times, anybody who's going to march out there in front of an enemy knowing you might be killed is an act of bravery in my mind by itself. It's not cowardice. I also think that it's not, how can I say, it's we use the word fighting sometimes to mean exclusively fighting physically, but if you're writing, if you're marching, if you're protesting, I mean, Dr. King, I tend to do this every year. I didn't read the whole letter this year, but I try to read the letter from the Birmingham jail every year. I read part of it this year. The whole definition of direct action is not cowering and running. It's actually confronting, but doing it in a non-physical, at least a violent, not a non-violent way. It's certainly physical. I mean, going somewhere, sitting at a lunch counter where you're told not to be there, or riding a bus where you're not supposed to, or walking somewhere you're not supposed to, it is fighting, it's resisting, it's being belligerent. You know what I mean? It's just not fighting back. So I think that the just going out there and having the faith to face down an overwhelming enemy, and actually having the courage, and I think John Lewis said this, having the courage, the moral conviction and courage to actually not strike back and hold to that tactic, because it is a tactic, it shows a lot of discipline, a lot of courage, and I think I don't want to dominate this conversation. I think for the civil rights movement, they were counting on the Southerners, the segregationists down south, to respond violently, because they were counting on them to do that, because it highlighted to the world the disparity between what they were asking for and the response. They were just asking for inclusion, good wages, fair job, to be treated as human being, to be acknowledged as human beings, and they were treated with water hoses, guns, and police dogs. You know what I mean? So they were counting on that image to add more credibility to the argument. So the short is not cowardice. It's actually very brave, and it shows a lot of discipline to literally say, I might not come back from this protest today, right. Because of the people that I'm protesting against. So,
Ryan, give me your view. Thank you, Doug.
We have this phrase that we use a lot in Christianity, coming from the scriptures, of taking up our cross and following after Jesus, right? And I think that this movement of nonviolent resistance, of going out in the face of knowing that you may very well not come back, is very much like, right, this call that we see to take up our cross. And I think so many in Christianity don't see that in their lives, because we're sitting in our churches so far removed from so many of these things, right, that we think that taking up our cross is having the worship time changed, right? Or not being able to sit in my pew on a Sunday, right? But there's this call, right? That is, when Jesus literally went out to be crucified for our sin and suffered that brutality, right? This idea that a call to discipleship may very well mean some sort of physical sacrifice in that manner, right? And so in that is in its truest form, right? Taking up the cross and following after that, and being willing to go out and commit to that tactic, and having the strength to remain nonviolent, recognizing that there may very well be violent penalties that face you on the other side of that.
What's echoing my mind is the fact that in our tradition, the prophet was engaged in war, and he did so for resisting an onslaught against his community for merely just being Muslims, and so he did pick up. Actually, he wasn't a sword; he was more proficient in a bow and arrow, but he did go to war to protect his life, his family's life, and the life of his tradition. Dawud, if I'm saying something wrong here, you can certainly correct me.
Interesting that you would. You're not saying anything wrong because, and that's why I'm quick to say that al-Islam, which revealed in the Quran, was demonstrated by the life of the Prophet Muhammad, is not a pacifist religion. I mean, for me, and I probably should have looked this up, but a pacifist is like communities like they don't believe in war. Period.
Right.
That's right. They are conscientious objectors. They will not be drafted. They don't defend themselves. They own no weapons. Their strength is solely their faith and moral beliefs. Period. That's what they're totally committed to peace in every way. They don't have a plan B. I guess that's the way the way to think about it. That's what pacifism is. That's not what's in the Quran. It's not what demonstrated by the Prophet Muhammad. But what is clear in the Quran and demonstrated by the Prophet Muhammad is that when there's an opportunity to stop fighting, you should do that. And if you do have the opportunity, or not the opportunity, if you have the necessity to fight in self-defense, first of all, it's only in self-defense. There are strict rules of conduct for war: no killing non-combatants, no burning down crops, no scorched earth policy, not dragging people off into slavery. That's why there's no ayat, there's no verse in the Quran or example of the Prophet Muhammad where it was a war fought to expand the faith in and of itself and to get more slaves. Like, that's not a reason. You know what I mean? So I think that people sometimes intentionally, I think, conflate those activities, and that's why I tried in my comments to give examples of 13 years of the Prophet Muhammad proselytizing nonviolently, and even in Medina, even when the Prophet was in Medina, chose to enter into a treaty, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. I may be putting the exit in the wrong place, where the Prophet Muhammad accepted unfavorable terms. The companions thought those terms were unfavorable, but it provided what I considered it was a ceasefire. There were hostilities between Medina and the Quraysh of Mecca, but it was a ceasefire which allowed the Muslims to proselytize and practice their faith. So I think you should, if you look at the totality of the Quran and the totality of the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the circumstance of actions that he took, you will see a balanced approach there.
And what I also remember quite well is the Quran chastising people when there was a call to stand up for the protection of one's life and property and religion. They were chastised by the Quran itself for staying at home.
Yes.
So it was not an act of strength or good character or moral character to stay at home because you had the fear of going to war. Steve, what do you think about that?
Find myself drawn to mostly agreeing with Dawud. I think it's the fact that we're speaking from shared verses and shared experience has a lot to go for it. The quote that you gave before about the one who saves a life saves the world is found in the Talmud. It's in Sanhedrin, word for word identical. So it's a teaching we share, and I think there's a truth in that. The idea remains still that the challenges are going to be there. Every one of our faiths represented on this panel has, in our history, had martyrs take their own lives to prevent being taken captive by an enemy for the glory of God. They've been elevated by our traditions for their actions. So it's that's not a pacifism. That's we have been engaged. The hero of the story of Hanukkah, Judah Maccabee, succeeds in standing up to the edicts and the army of Antiochus Epiphanes of Syria, this nonviolent actor. The traditionalist Jews refused to take up arms on the Sabbath because it would be a desecration of Shabbat. And Antiochus's troops quickly figured this out and attacked on the Sabbath. And those who were not aligned with Judah Maccabee died rather than take up their arms. Judah looked at his people and said, we're not going to die. If we die, we take the faith with us. If we have to pick up our arms and defend ourselves on Shabbat, God will forgive us for it.
Yeah.
And convinced his followers to do it. To me, that's morally an equivalent to what Dr. King was trying to get his followers to do in the 50s and 60s. Change the way we think about the system. Reality to dictate to us what our behavior and our souls and our hearts tell us to do.
Yeah.
There's a soul power in that, and it's not a violence, but it is physical, and it is mental, and it is emotional, and it is spiritual.
Yeah. The senator who actually got hit over the head, whose name I can't remember, crossing the bridge.
John Lewis, Congressman Lewis.
Right.
I just mentioned him.
John Lewis.
John Lewis.
Right. Should John Lewis have protected himself? Reverend Ware, since you're here, Ryan, tell me, should John Lewis have protected himself from getting beat over the head and almost, well, he was knocked unconscious. He was dragged to the hospital to be restored. What do you think? And don't forget, you're from my hometown.
I mean, I think that, again, it goes back to what we've touched on several different times, right? Of the strength that it takes to practice nonviolence. And if that was his commitment, and then I think he made his choice, right? The scripture that I mentioned from Jesus, right? Turn the other cheek. I think so oftentimes we read this text and we use it to gloss over abuse, right? And it's not like Jesus is saying stand around and just keep getting hit over the hammer until you die, right? Jesus is not saying that, but that if in this context that was his commitment, and we know that it was, then he knew that going out there that might happen.
Right.
Conversely, I think at the same time, if he had chosen to take some sort of defensive stand, I don't think anybody would have looked down on him for it. But I think we look on with admiration and say, this was a man who had great strength and who stood in his faith and went out and was committed to this way of nonviolence.
Dr. Kaskas, what say you? I've got people who are committed to nonviolence here, which I think is great. But I'm curious about the fact that there are people, including the Prophet Muhammad, who actually went to war to save his life, as well as to save property and to save people who wanted to eradicate, by killing him, eradicate Islam from the planet. Tell me, what are your views?
I disagree with the question, actually, as it is posed to me.
You always disagree with the question.
That's okay. That's
All right.
I mean, let me pose the question in a different way. Prophet Muhammad wasn't fighting to defend his own life. If we look at the fight as he was fighting to defend his own life, I think we will be tackling the problem from the wrong point of view. The Prophet lived in Mecca for many years after he started his call to the worship of the one God, Allah. And during those years, his followers were killed, He was insulted, he was beaten, he was all kind of stuff happened, and he
Yeah.
didn't even lift a finger to
Yeah.
defend himself. So I'm objecting to the word defending himself
Okay.
or defending his own life. That's not what happened. What happened is, after he moved to Medina, he received an order to start defending the group who joined him, who left everything back in Mecca, left their wealth, left their homes, in some instances left their families behind, and came and joined him in Medina. And in Medina, they noticed that the group that persecuted them in Mecca still persecuting their families, their relatives, and other people, and stole whatever wealth they left behind. Then they were ordered to defend themselves as a group of people. So if you mean by self-defense defending the group, yes, it wasn't at all in my point of view to defend himself, and only when they stood up to defend first their faith from being annihilated completely, second their wealth that was stolen, and each other, to show solidarity and to build stronger bases for a group to grow, that they received that order. But actually they were acting on an order from Allah, who permitted to those that were oppressed to defend themselves. So that's the way I see it.
Yes. I'm just curious. This notion of nonviolence is one that Dr. King was very strong in promoting, and I think I would say that he promoted it his entire life. I didn't realize that he was chastised as badly as he was. I understand he went to jail in Alabama for 12 times, and there was hardly a day that he had in the latter years of his movement that he did not was threatened. He was threatened. His life was threatened. There is a notion in the Quran. I'm glad you're here, because I know you translated the Quran, where God Himself is chastising people who refused to come out to meet the enemies that were going to eradicate them. Tell me what your view is of that invitation by God in relationship to nonviolence.
Nonviolence is when we take an ideological stand that we reject violence completely. It's not cowardness. It's a decision I'm making, saying that my faith in God, because I believe in God, and because I am at best loving Him when I love my neighbor, that I don't want to engage in violence against any other human being. That's one stand.
Yeah.
And this stand is one thing, and trying to run away from a battle or from a fight, knowing that all your neighbors are threatened and you need to be with them, defending the community, yet you decide to stay behind. The two are not equal. Okay? The two are not equal. One is an ideological stand that's saying, I will never engage in violence against another human being, regardless what they do to me.
That's the practice. Yeah.
The other is describing a group of people who decided not to join their community in a fight to defend the community. They're cowards, basically.
Right.
I cannot make the two equal. Now, if you want to talk about, see, I can look at that because I love Dr. King and I have tremendous respect for him. I will tell you, based on what I understand from his philosophy, and I looked into it in depth, I think it's a strategy. Nonviolence in his case
I agree.
was a faith, was based on faith, and a strategy.
Yeah.
He was facing an enemy that is a million times with more resources and and can crush him and his community. And it happened before. It wouldn't be the first time, And strategically, he decided to choose non-violence. I will not minimize, though, his commitment to faith or his commitment to his own faith. And I respect him for that commitment. The same way I respect all those who would decide to follow Jesus and decide not to fight against any other human being. That's an ideological decision. Okay? Now, in Islam, I understand Islam maybe differently from other people. And I understand what Muslim mean. Again, maybe I define it differently from other people. Because Islam and Muslim have the same root. In Arabic, we try to understand the words by going to their roots, So
Right.
Islam and Muslim have the same root, silm, S-L-M, silm, which is in Arabic as well as in Hebrew, mean the same thing, peace. So by definition, according to this, a Muslim is a peacemaker. And Islam is if'al, that means putting the theory into practice. So Islam is actually practicing peace or effecting peace or putting peace into action to make it a reality.
Sure.
If Muslims understand Islam this way, I think the face of the world will change.
Khalil, can I respond?
Yes, please go right ahead.
First of all, Safi, a pleasure to be with you again. I miss you, my friend.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much.
I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I want to not push back, but get you to elucidate a little bit more.
Okay.
I heard in your statement about Dr. King and his use of the strategy of nonviolence, what I think was a statement that said, if your faith is stronger than the power of your arms and your weapons, then nonviolence makes sense. Was I hearing that, a hint of that, at least in your words first? And then second, I love the comparison of the roots between Hebrew and Arabic. And I'm well familiar with shalom and salam, but is my understanding correct that salam in its root form, even though it leads us to the same peace that shalom does, has more of a root meaning of submission, of giving oneself over to a higher authority, whereas the root in Hebrew for shalom, the shin lamed mem, is more of a sense of completion and fulfillment. And I've always been intrigued by that, if my understanding is correct, that those two very different base meanings of the roots become lodged together and both lead us to peace from different perspectives.
Well, the question is very interesting, of course. And actually, I'll start with the last question because it's easier for me to understand. I've been talking about this full time for at least a year now. And the job is humongous. Basically, it's trying to change the mind of average Muslim from one state of mind to another state of mind, from thinking that it's mandatory upon him to fight, and he's feeling guilty because he's not fighting, into another state of mind that's saying, you are asked by your creator to build peace on earth. That's your main job. And unless you are defending yourself, defending your own life, you're not at all to feel guilty for not even thinking about a fight,
Well,
So
self-defense is an act of keeping the peace, yes?
Well, let me talk about myself and my own thinking, because I cannot generalize. I don't like generalization at all. I'll give you only my point of view, and it's a point of view. It's a one Muslim's opinion, and I can tolerate other opinions and understand them. And I think Islam is open for this, as well as Judaism, as well as Christianity, for among my Christian friends that I know. I think the more opinions we have, the wealthier as a humanity that we are. So actually, in the definition that Rabbi Steve gave, I'm more leaning toward the Jewish understanding than to the average Muslim understanding here. Why? Because average Muslims believe that jihad, in their own mind, meaning fighting, is a missing foundation of Islam that they need to revive. I don't think that is essential at all, nor do I see any backing for it, neither in the Quran nor in the Sunnah. And I think teaching our children anything other than they are peacemakers is leading us to where we are today. And I don't like where we are today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would, in order for Muslim to rebuild a civilization and contribute to human civilization, they need to recognize that they are peacemakers, and they need to be engaged actually in building peace anywhere there is a conflict.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I am proud to tell you that I'm a part of the group that put together the National Prayer Breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
And this year, I did my utmost best to convince the people in charge to bring together Israelis and Palestinians, because if the followers of Jesus don't engage in peace building, they're useless. Nobody needs them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We need this national prayer breakfast, for instance, or any meeting where
Mm-hmm.
followers of Jesus are in charge of, to engage in building peace.
Mm-hmm.
And for a
Right.
while now,
Yeah.
today, all day long, I've been with the people at our mosque in Shirley Gate,
Mm-hmm.
Fairfax County Mosque,
Right.
talking to young people about exactly the same thing,
Yes.
teaching them that Islam means to put peace into action, and Muslim is the guy in charge of this, and as such, he's a peacemaker.
Alhamdulillah. The Professor Kaskas, thank you for your enlightened words. I appreciate you very much. I want to give everyone, just for the sake of fairness, by Ryan, Steve, Dawud, just a few minutes of a final word.
Jump in if that's okay. Professor Kaskas, I just want to thank you for that, because I really feel like this is the space that so many of us are finding ourselves in, right? That we've got to get this mentality of peace building and peacemaking. And we're seeing that in our congregations, we're seeing that in our communities, we're seeing that, in the national stage and the international stage playing out. And I really feel like this is our call as the church today, and as fellow believers in God, to come together and to build peace and to be committed to that. And so I think that, that's really what I want to leave us with, is that is the call that the church is finding itself in, and that we all are facing as brothers and sisters and fellow believers in God, that this is the way. And this is the future that we have to engage in, or there will be none, as we said earlier.
Dawud?
Is there theological support for nonviolence? In my comments, I kind of framed it like everyone else did, within the context of nonviolent resistance. I feel like that the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad provide a framework for nonviolent resistance. I gave examples in the Quran about nonviolence and the sanctity of life, how important it is not to kill or not to unjustly kill anyone, any innocent person. It's like you killed all humanity. That's a shared value with Christianity and with Judaism, and specifically, as Rabbi Weisman mentioned in the I think maybe in some of the rabbinical writings, I think, or the Talmud is what you might have mentioned. I gave a recent example of Sheikh Amadou Bamba in West Africa, Senegal, who conducted a nonviolent resistance movement against French colonialism. I think it's important to look at examples like that, because we often tend to be very fixated on what's now called the Middle East, and not often remembering that even though most Arabs are Muslims, most Muslims are not Arabs. There's a rich tradition of Muslims in West Africa. The most populous Muslim countries in Indonesia, and Islam spread to those areas generally through trade, scholarship, and other means. And I'll just say that I also understood Dr. King's nonviolent 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 or direct action as a strategy borrowed from Mahatma Gandhi against an overwhelming force, and actually was almost counting on the response that he received to actually illustrate the difference between the moral position that the civil rights movement was taking versus the unjust, tyrannical position that the segregated South was taking, and just exposing the fact that America was not living up to its founding principles in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, or its Judeo-Christian tradition. So that's what I tried to bring together in my comments today. So
excellent. Steve, your last word.
Okay, I'm going to take two last words, one for me and one I'm going to pass back to where it belongs. The first part of my question to Dr. Kaskas was because as I was listening to him and thinking about it, I pray to have the faith in my God, the God that I believe in, that is strong enough for me to put down my arms when I feel I need to take them up. And I pray that for anyone else who is ever in a position to feel that they need to take up arms. And if that puts me in the camp of Dr. King, then I'm honored. If it puts me in the camp of those prophets who came before me of all faiths, I am honored. And my last word, because Reverend Ware started us with Jesus on the mountain, preaching the Beatitudes, is blessed are the peacemakers.
Steve, thank you. I can tell you that obviously learning is what this is all about, and this was very beneficial to me. Thank you for taking some time out of your schedule to make Khalil Shadid a better person. But I can say that again, your time is amazing. I'm looking forward to putting this into the general public by broadcasting it. It's okay with you, you all, for if you allow me to do that. It has been very beneficial to the public discussion. I like to think that Prince George's County and in my home county, Henry County, is a better place because of this discussion. So thank you very much for coming. And we are at the end of our time, but hopefully we can do this very, very, very soon. Again.
Thank you for calling us together, my friend.
Thank you.